You're welcome back to the conversation in News Central Television. In the first half of the show, we did discuss the ongoing protest in Ghana over the rising cost of commodities. It's now time for us to switch gears to Egypt, where the 27th session of the Conference of Parties, COP27, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is officially kicked off in the Egyptian city of Sharm el-Sheikh. Heads of states and governments of different countries are scheduled to address the ongoing meeting. This year's event, which will continue till November the 18th, is expected to give results acting on agreements, decisions and commitments reached in the past, including the Rio Declaration and COP26.
Now at COP26, countries agreed to try to prevent global temperatures rising by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. However, the pledges on emissions cuts made there were inadequate to achieve that goal, so governments also agreed to return to the table this year with improved plans. And now joining us for this ongoing conversation, we have Paul Abolo, President, Ecologistics Integrated Services from Abuja. We also have Dr. Gbujie Daniel, a founder, Team 54 Project International, who joins us from North Dakota, United States of America. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us on the conversation. All right, so I'll begin with you, Dr. Daniel. I mean, the world is experiencing some of the most extreme weather patterns, from floods to heat waves, which a lot of us are experiencing. Now, Africa has been responsible for less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but it is by far the most vulnerable region to the effects of climate change. So tell us, just how bad is the situation in Africa?
You have concretized where our agenda is. And I think your station needs to be commended for that. Now, we need to unbundle some of the statistics that you have given so that our audience understand. Now, most of these emissions that we are seeing all started during the Industrial Revolution 150 years ago, which, of course, like you rightfully have identified, that Africa was not involved. Secondly, because of the insincere way of doing business within our country, many of all the pollutions, or what we now call the chemical flow of gases that have entered into our atmosphere, by atmosphere I mean the things we breathe in, the things you see in our environment, are also having unintended consequences on people's health and in the environment. So the COP27, like one of your presenters has said, your anchor person has said, is to re-emphasize and reposition us to ensure that we deepen our commitment on addressing this issue. It is bad because in the last 8 weeks, all continents have been experiencing flooding, and I will explain. September 1, Pakistan had a massive flood. As we speak today, more than 7 million people totally destroyed. Okay, it's not Africa, let us ignore. Turkey, 3 days after, over 160,000 people finished. Okay, let us leave that. 2 weeks after the Turkey one, we now have Nigeria. Nigeria has flooded, in which, and I quote, the governor of a state is saying that 1/3 of the state has already been submerged. So where is the problem? The problem is this, that since 1992, we've not been sincere. That's the truth. World leaders across board have been pushing the plate. And then ignorance or non-education of major stakeholders, especially African leaders that are in position to reduce emission, to begin the process of adaptation, to teach our people on how to be more smarter in the inventions or in the processes that trigger all these climate actions. So what you're experiencing, which is rightfully so, are the tipping points. The tipping points are natural processes that we originally, before now, when me and you were growing up, are used to, are now beginning to be stretched beyond the limits. One of those things are our waterways, the ocean. Another thing is the level of emission. Another thing that I know of is climate change. So the way we see climate and we report climate has not been very nice, because we don't keep data. We just have policies on paper. We do not implement. Even when we do implement, there's what they call correction or evaluation or review. We have not reviewed. If you do recall in sciences, while we're in Nigeria, they tell us that every 10 to 20 years or a decade, that the environment always changes, and there's need for us to reevaluate that. Have you ever heard what our emission rate is now, or what our weather patterns are now? So the prediction for the flooding that took place just about 12 days ago was already forecasted by the World Meteorological Society. But what did Nigeria do? What did the people do? What did the people in government do? So these are the discussions that will be going on in COP. We want a situation where financing will be given, and then leaders will now be held accountable, for any actions that they do. And you said something very important. Nations already have what we call the nationally determined contribution. What it means is these are what we will do in our own corner to ensure we help the environment and reduce emission and prevent this. So these are some of the talking points. Climate financing, actions for Africa. It's actually called an African COP, but some Western world call it the implementation COP. Thank you.
Now, I'm happy you stopped on that note, implementation COP. The United Nations Climate Summits, COPs, are held every year for governments to agree to limit global temperature rises. Critics have said they are nothing more than a talk shop, and concrete actions are hardly taken. Just in the last few weeks, in the wake of the Russian-Ukraine war, the Germans decided to restore coal-fired plants to help their energy needs to prepare for the coming winter because of the shortfall they're getting from the sanctions with Russia and what have you. What's your view on this? Because if you look at COP26, the promises that were made on climate financing, nothing has been done. So how do we, are this conferences just a talk shop, or what do you make of it?
Okay, yes, I thought it was for Engineer Abolo, but you are very right. And I'm happy that the audience and journalists like you are beginning to see some of what we call the greenwashing. So greenwashing is when people come to national TV, our leaders come in and say, we are committed to the environment, we are committed to our people, we want to ensure the principles of sustainable development goal, and then that ends it. Now, what I think of it is this. The truth of the matter is that we have boxed ourselves as human beings into a corner. And it's so sad and unfortunate that Africa is in where it is because, one, democratic principles have not been stable. Over time, people have been greedy. People have not been looking at the data to know what is going on. How come the quantum of rain has changed over the last period of time? Secondly, people forget that in 2007, rightfully so, the first time the United Nations Security Council recognized that climate change caused a war. I know everybody will say, what is this saying? South Sudan and Sudan splitting up was as a result of climate change in 2007. You can go and look at the report. They started fighting for resources like water that was drying up. They started complaining about the issues that concern herdsmen within their space in South Sudan. And that desertification continued. It became worse. Nobody planted trees. Nobody tried to activate what we call the decarbonization system. That is, try to levy emitters, levy people coming into your waterways, build them high. If you are coming in with products that are harmful of the environment, you pay 30% of the total cost to bring it in. These are some of the talking points and the climate financing model that the COP is trying to do, how to agree on it. And you raised a very important point, and that's that Germany are technically, trying to reactivate the coal. And this is what Africans need to wake up and ask themselves. We can't continue to live in a shadow where people come out, have polluted the environment, destroyed the environment, have set organizations, oil companies into African spaces to explore this oil, knowing fully well that oil exploration releases methane, deadly gases, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, that goes to disrupt the atmospheric platform. Doing that now triggers all this cataclysmic stuff. I'm a medical personnel. We're having more cancers, we're having more floods, we're having increased temperature, we're having allergies, we're having diseases that normally often do not, and the solutions are there. And I think that's what we should be discussing on on our program. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, Paul, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation. We've dealt with how badly this is affecting Africa and a whole lot of things, the effect of this, even on the whole world and on the African continent. Now, this is the 5th time that the COP has been hosted in Africa. Now, earlier on, Dr. Daniel talked about how much we've had talks. We've had COP26, and even for this COP27, we'll still be having discussions from the COP26. Now, for this particular one happening in Africa, in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, are there any particularly Africa-centric issues that will be highlighted this year for the good of Africa? Okay, so Engineer Abolo, if you can hear me, we're looking at Africa-centric issues to deal with this climate change, because over time, we see that Africa suffers a lot from this climate change going on. Now we have COP27 happening in Africa, Egypt. How will these issues be better for Africa?
Okay, I get you now a little bit. Now, it's a great thing that COP27 is holding on the African continent. The last time we hosted the COP was COP22 in Marrakesh, Morocco. But this is more relevant now in light of the heightened awareness about climate change. When we held this in Morocco in 2016, that was just 1 year after the Paris Agreement. Between that time and now, people have had time to digest and understand exactly what the provisions of the Paris Agreement is. Now, a whole lot of complexities have come into play. The 2022 flood heightened the awareness. The Russian-Ukraine war has also created a new dimension to how we are going to look at issues at COP27. Now, Africa contributes significantly low, maybe less than 4%, with other developing nations to the cause of global warming and, of course, to climate change. So, yet, Africa and other developing countries have the least capacity to deal with impacts of climate change. So, at COP27, you hear us talking about loss and damage and reparations. So the negotiations are going to be taken to a different level this time. We are moving from aid to reparations. Why will we be asking you to give us aid to deal with the problems that you caused? So the negotiation needs to be a little bit more realistic this time. And one of the things that we also need to look at is carbon, which is the currency for climate change. We need to know exactly where we place carbon. We need to know how we trade carbon. We need to know how we exchange carbon. At this point, we need to bring it to the fore and zero down on how the carbon currency needs to work for Africa. The third element that we need to look at is technology. No one is just going to sit and give you money as much as you want, but you need to engage technology at scale to be able to unlock the business of climate change, to be able to unlock the finances. And then attached to that is the private sector investment. Private sector investment is required to unlock the climate change funds. So, or whichever way, the climate funds may unlock the private sector funds, whichever way, you will need the private sector to come in at scale to create the finance that is needed to make this transition. I'll tell you, this is not just a regular transition. This is a serious transition. And there is a word that just transition means that you need to support us to make that transition. Those who have the least capacity to adapt and those who have the least capacity to adapt their development to climate-resilient development pathways, they need some element of support. And who are we talking about? We're talking about Africa. We're talking about developing countries. So COP27 on the African continent has a lot to do for us on our soil. We need to talk decisively. We need to be very intentional in the negotiations. And the developed nations need to understand the impact of climate change on Africa and developing nations. And they also need to understand that we have least capacity to deal with the impacts.
Thank you very much, Engineer Abolo. I would like to stay with you, Engineer Abolo, because you talked about mitigating the effects of climate change on the continent. And we do know that money is very important in this conversation. Dr. Daniel mentioned that climate financing would also be top of the agenda in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, the amount of money rich countries give to the developing world to help it cope with its climate change will be one of the big battles that we would have in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, a pledge to provide $100 billion a year by 2020 has not been met. Poorer countries are demanding action. There's a saying that charity begins at home. How does Africa bridge this funding gap, and what can we do as a people instead of, going from conferences to conferences, begging for aid, like you said, when we're not the ones that caused us problems in the first place? How can we bridge this funding gap?
Talking about gaps, there is a huge gap. One, in the amount that was agreed upon based on the Paris Agreement, $100 billion financially a year. We haven't even been able to meet that target as at this time. That is one major gap. There's also another gap that needs to be bridged. That is the technology gap. The technology gap needs to be bridged. And then there's also the third gap that needs to be bridged, needs to be in terms of awareness and stakeholder engagement. The flood that we've had this year has heightened the awareness, like I said earlier. But in terms of gaps, these three major gaps need to be bridged. The funding gap, the technology gap, and of course, the awareness gap.
Okay, now, Dr. Daniel, quickly, looking at the impact, you said earlier on that this is just a tip of the iceberg. Talk about flooding. How bad can it get if we continue just negotiations and nothing is being done to cut this green gas emissions?
Yes, thank you so much. And I must commend your anchor and both of you. I wish people can listen to how informed you are. Now, it's going to get bad. This is just a bad part. This is they call this on the early stage of the tipping point. It's going to get to a level where most of the southern coastal cities who are on the line plane. So the line plane is this, that if you look at from Ghana to Accra to Gabon to Sierra Leone, all the capitals before now, except for Abuja now that has moved, used to be within the line plane coast. All those ones are being forecasted to all be underwater by 2050 or even earlier. So the solution, like one of your anchor person has said, is this. We need to invest seriously in what we call clean energy plan. And that's what the US is doing. The US just released one of their largest, robust policy on environment about 18 weeks ago. In that robust stuff, clean energy, that is energy from the source from primary sources like water, sunlight, wind, that will not create emissions, will now be invested on, and companies that invest on that will be good. Africa can do that as one of the solutions. Another thing is also what you also raised. There's an individual component to this. It's not just about government and then the back and front, you should pay us, you won't pay us, you cost it, and you didn't cost it. There's an African adage that says, if you don't open the door, the cat will not come in to destroy the rat. Some Africans are actively working with some of these oil companies that should know better to stifle our growth. So the key is you must invest in clean energy, and that's what we want to do. Now, one of your anchors also raised, how do we raise the money? This is the questions we need to be asking both international community and ourselves. Now for Nigeria or for Africa, for ourselves, we can raise money by leveling tax. Anytime there's a gas flaring, anytime there's a gas flaring, per second billing, there should be credit levied on those oil companies. They're not doing that because oil companies have a way of siphoning the process and also settling of some sort, some of the officials within this oil upstream and downstream system. Another thing we can do is mandate that individually we start to plant agriculture, we start to plant trees, and we start to practice what they call the eco-smart agricultural practice, where you don't need to be burning grasses again. People don't burn forests, burn things to plant again. There are smarter ways to plant now. There are high-yielding seeds that increase productivity. And then the issue of solar. Government can mandate solar panel companies that are many in the United States, in Europe, to come on board.
Dr. Daniel, you have so many things in store for us now. Eco-smart agricultural practices, renewable solar energies. I mean, we'll still have these conversations going on and on. We have the COP27 from November 6th to November 8th. Now, we do hope to have you back again on the program with us to discuss how better we can save the planet and, of course, save the continent. Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel. And, of course, Paul Abolo, Engineer Paul Abolo, for joining us in the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, this is where we conclude the conversation today. Thank you very much for being a part of the show. I'm Gbenga Aborowa.
And I am Rita Omodia. See you again on Wednesday.